The Spin-off Podcast Network. This podcast was made with the support of New Zealand On Air.
Some of the language used in this episode is pretty hideous. Take care. Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Toby Manhire for the Spin-off Podcast Network, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. 40 years ago, a snap election was called, the dam burst, and New Zealand was launched into a giddy metamorphosis. When we left off in the last episode, the Lange-Douglas relationship at the centre of this radical reform in government was approaching a boiling point. And we will return to that molten furnace psychodrama, I promise. But even if you leave to one side the economic reforms and the overhaul of the public service, even if you leave to one side the nuclear and ANZUS issue, there are a whole host of other changes witnessed over those years, including major and enduring social and cultural transformations. Some get lost in the blur. Others aren't strictly government reforms at all. And there's one, a very big one, which it turns out is the result of a slip of the tongue.
I say that this is an evil bill.
Night after night, we wallow in the squalid, revolting terminology.
Honestly, for me anyway, it was a halcyon period to be a public servant.
I don't want to debate the treaty. I don't want to renegotiate the treaty.
I thought all my happy days had come.
This is episode 5, 9-Day Wonder.
A bill stands in the name of Fran Wilde.
Mr. Speaker, I move that leave be given to introduce the homosexual law reform bill.
It's March 8th, 1985, just a week after David Lange's big uranium night at the Oxford Union, and the Labour MP for Wellington Central is making good on a pledge to introduce a private member's bill.
I'm Fran Wilde and I was a Labour Member of Parliament.
39 years later, we're at Wilde's home in Thorndon, just up the hill from Parliament.
Before the 81 election, I was lobbied by members of the gay community in Wellington. They said to me, would I support legislation to decriminalise homosexuality? And of course, I said, yes, I will do that. And then a kind of a throwaway question at the end before they left, they said, and what say we needed somebody to sponsor a bill? Would you be interested in doing that? And I said, well, I'd never thought about that, but obviously, it would be something I'd need to think about. So after the election, they came back to me and said, guess what, Fran, you're it. And I thought about it and said, well, okay, I will do it because I was in a very liberal electorate, arguably the most liberal electorate in New Zealand at the time. And I was a woman, so I wasn't a gay man, and, I was heterosexual. I thought, I thought that would give me a bit of protection from some of the abuse that would come.
A group of Auckland lawyers draft a bill. It's called the Equality Bill.
So I raised this with the Labour caucus, and recall we had nearly won the 81 election, and we kind of knew that we were going to win the next election, but nobody wanted to take any risks. And particularly this bill was seen as highly risky. Some of them vehemently opposed it, but overall politically it was seen as high risk for the Labour Party, and they did not want me to introduce it.
In 1984, Muldoon's snap election backfires and a bigger, more upbeat Labour caucus gathers.
After the election, we started talking about what was then called the homosexual law reform bill. The response then wasn't quite as vehemently negative as it had been previously, but there were a lot of MP seniors who did not want this introduced because they said it'll just be a distraction from all the other things we have to do. We were very much behind the curve. Other countries had done this many years prior and it just had to be done. It was a basic human rights mechanism which we had not adopted.
What about the leader, Lange?
He wasn't obstructive, no, at all, and he supported it.
This isn't the first bill to decriminalise homosexuality that gets tabled in Parliament. In 1974, then Young, a National MP, had tabled a member's bill. Young's bill prompted a gay university student called Marilyn Waring to choose her political stripes.
Then Young had introduced the first homosexual law reform bill into the New Zealand Parliament, and The Prime Minister of the time, Norman Kirk, had said that he would vote against it because it just wasn't normal behaviour and he didn't support that. And I was in the Rankin Brown Library at Victoria University reading the paper. And I got up and walked down to the National Party headquarters and paid a sub to join.
Young's bill is voted down, as another will be 5 years later, from Labour MP Warren Freer. By this point, Waring's sexuality is in the public domain. And that's because in 1976, the same year that Colin Moyle resigns his seat after insinuations of homosexuality, the newspaper Truth outs Marilyn Waring on its front page with the headline, MP's Odd Love Affair. An awkwardly cropped photo of the National Party MP, then aged just 24, sits above an ad for Glenvale Sparkling White Riesling. Marilyn Waring is a lesbian, the tabloid report begins, describing her living in a Wellington love nest with a mother of 3. The article prompts a backlash and an outpouring of public support for the young MP. But after she quits Parliament in 84, the total number of out gay MPs returns to naught. To be clear, in 1985, as Fran Wilde's bill goes before Parliament, there are precisely 0 out gay MPs in the House of Representatives. And there won't be for another 9 years, when Chris Carter is elected.
It's pretty deforming at an individual level.
This is Bill Logan. We're talking at his home in Mount Victoria, Wellington.
And yeah, there were quite a few people who, one way or another, found themselves in trouble with the law. Often things wouldn't come to prosecution, but the police would be brought into personal lives in completely inappropriate ways. I grew up in a liberal professional kind of family, and I was expected to be a lawyer or a doctor. And of course, there was no chance of really being a lawyer or a doctor and openly gay. And so you hid your gayness. And I hid it from myself, in fact. I didn't know I was gay until I was well into my 20s. I taught politics at Vic for a little while. I then had a little bookshop in town, which was great fun. I didn't make any money selling books, but that was a bit of a centre for the gay community. I was involved in the Gay Switchboard, which was a kind of information, advice, peer counselling kind of service. That was, in a way, my crowd. So we had a meeting with Fran in the Gay Community Centre in Bulcott Street, and out of that was born the Gay Task Force in Wellington.
And I started working, the Gay Task Force in Wellington were very helpful, and the Auckland group got bigger and they started doing fundraising, and it became a significant campaign.
The bill is in 2 parts. One will legalise consenting sex between homosexual men 16 and over. Lesbian sex has never been illegal. And the other is to outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation.
I know that some members support the principle of homosexual law reform but disagree with me on the age of consent. Others question the Human Rights Commission proposal. I ask them to vote for the introduction of this bill. Do not discard the whole bill because you do not agree with part of it. This reform is long overdue in New Zealand, and I ask the House to vote to allow the introduction of the homosexual law reform bill.
Norman Jones, the member for Invercargill, wastes no time in laying out his stance.
If the good Lord wanted us to procreate the race through the rear, he'd have put the womb down there somewhere. That's all I can say. And as though we're not animals. Look, I'm no moraliser, but we cannot. Order.
Jones is supported by another National MP, John Banks.
I say that this is an evil bill.
The most vociferous opponent on the Labour benches is Jeff Braybrook.
I personally view homosexual activities as unnatural and perverted acts.
Among the vocal advocates for the bill is Labour MP Helen Clark.
Sir, this bill challenges us to put aside our prejudices, our predispositions, and it appeals to the rational side of each of us for some tolerance and acceptance of the sexual orientation and practices of others.
Those who are in favour will say aye. Those with the contrary opinion will say no. The ayes have it.
The bill passes its first hurdle by 51 to 24. It's a 90-seat parliament at this point. In public, Wilde suggests it's just a matter of getting through the parliamentary process.
People just want to get it changed and get on with other more real sorts of things. I believe it will be a 9-day wonder. The law will be changed and that will be it.
But privately, she knows there is a hill to climb.
In those days, there was this, I'll call it a gentleman's agreement because I think there were only 8 women in the House. It was still an overwhelmingly male place. Gentleman's agreement in Parliament that a private member's bill, regardless of what it was, would always get that first reading. It was never voted down at the first reading. It would always be sent to a select committee. And then the prevailing wisdom was it would be killed in the select committee. It would never come out of it, basically. But we knew that that day we had done our numbers already. And I knew that only 19 of the people who voted for it to be introduced would have voted for it if it had been the third reading that day. So we had quite a big job to do.
The focus of the campaign is public sentiment in electorates where the local MP personally backs reform but is nervous about getting punished by voters at the next election.
It became very clear that if New Zealanders were going to give permission to their MPs to vote, New Zealanders themselves had to change their mind. Many people's views were based on stereotypes. So we'd all grown up taught that homosexuals were depraved child molesters, etc., etc. And in fact, when I was a kid, I didn't even know what gay was. But later on in life, I realised that a guy that we called, Uncle somebody, Charlie, I'll call him, it wasn't Charlie, but who was a single guy and a devout Catholic and lived by himself. And he was gay, obviously. That was what you did in those days.
In a way, the law change wasn't what it was all about. Now, we just had to have a victory, and we had to have a big public discussion about it, and we had to change people's minds, because it was the attitudes, the change of attitudes, which was the important thing. The building of respect, visibility, dignity, things like that.
The campaign did get very big, much bigger than I ever anticipated. We all knew it would be pretty awful, but it erupted on the streets in a huge way. It was nasty. Fortunately, there was no social media in those days. I seriously doubt that this bill would have got through then if we'd had social media as we see it today, where people just pick up facts, in inverted commas, that are not facts at all. Many of them weren't death threats. They were just, this is what I would do to you if I could get you, you pervert. Many of them just assumed I was lesbian, and what you need is, good rogering to sort you out, basically. And so it was pretty awful stuff, actually. And it gave me a bit of an insight into what the gay community and the lesbian community had to put up with forever. I only had it for a couple of years, but this is what they lived with.
It was quite nasty. And there was an uprise in the violence against gays in the cities on a Friday, Saturday night. Yeah, some of it was very, very nasty.
People had sons and brothers and friends, next door neighbours, workmates who were gay, but they did not know they were gay. So visibility became critical. And this, I think, was one of the single biggest factors in actually moving public opinion, when gay men started to come out publicly. And remember that for them it was quite dangerous, because if the bill hadn't gone through, the retribution would have been huge.
A few weeks after the bill is tabled, a public meeting is held in a Lower Hutt hall, hosted by the high-profile Conservative activist Patricia Bartlett.
I was a bit nervous about that meeting beforehand, because I knew that our people were very upset by some of the things that had been said, and were likely to be more upset. So I arrived early to case the joint, really, and Patricia Bartlett was there making tea, and she was the only person there. I said, "Oh, Miss Bartlett, I presume," and she said, "Mr. Logan, I presume." But the meeting became wild.
members of the Gay Task Force asked for a chance to have their say.
And Norman Jones started yelling abuse and said, "We've paid for this, and if you want to speak, you've got to pay." It was a fatal mistake. I just threw up my hand and said, "Done." And he said, "Well, you've got to pay now." And I said, "That's okay, give us the money, guys." And it was a wonderful piece of theatre. And we paid for the chance to speak from the platform.
Norman Jones is incandescent. Now, the audio quality of this clip is ropey, but it's worth listening to. Remember, this is an elected Member of Parliament.
You're back into the sewers. You're back into the sewers where you come from. Turn around and look at them. Turn around and look at them. Look at them. Gaze upon them. You're looking into Hades. They're looking at the homosexuals. Don't look too long. You might catch AIDS. All right. Thank you very much.
The promoters of the homosexual law reform bill build alliances across New Zealand. They draw on networks that had opposed the Springbok tour and nuclear tests, and they're bolstered by Māori rights groups and by lesbian activists.
The lesbian community were fantastic. They were very, very staunch. And again, I mean, in all of the demos, they were in the front line, the women were there, and others too who saw it as being a minority that had been basically persecuted by society.
And so it was a matter of us holding together a coalition which went from Labour Party women and liberal academics and clerics to lesbian separatist feminists to nasty misogynist rich old gay men, and try to keep these people kind of accepting each other, making allowances for each other, understanding each other's motives and so on. So unite your friends, divide your enemies.
Divide your enemies, or, if you can, keep them out of town.
All of the antis, we would try and find them invitations to be out of Wellington on the Wednesday.
Wednesday's the day when private members' bills go to the House.
So groups all around New Zealand in the most obscure places would actually invite an MP, probably someone they disliked intensely, but nonetheless invite them to come and speak on a subject in that town on a Wednesday afternoon, evening, so they couldn't get back to Wellington for a vote.
The human rights part of the bill, which would outlaw discrimination against gay people, doesn't survive.
The ayes are 31. The noes are 49. The part 2 will not stand part.
I mean, it was a big setback, but we needed to get decriminalisation across the line. If we hadn't, then gay men would have been open targets, and particularly the people that had come out, which was many of them, and it would have just made life untenable for them.
There is another factor lending urgency to the cause. A deadly, infectious disease is circling the globe.
We had AIDS coming at us at a fast rate of knots.
That the vote to legalise homosexuality at 16 years of age will be voting to legalise the spread of AIDS throughout this New Zealand community.
That's Norman Jones again. And this is another National Party MP, Winston Peters, eyeballing Fran Wilde in the House.
She can laugh and scoff, but I tell her, and within a very short time, she will be held as the principal person in New Zealand responsible for the fastest growing medical anomaly that this country has. That's what she will carry on her shoulders for the rest of her life.
But the logic of it supported us. You know, the more open people can be about their sexual lives, the more open they can be to the educational public health messages of a campaign to limit the spread of HIV. So, it was a matter of making those arguments.
The only logical connection which you can draw between AIDS and this bill is that this bill will be a very valuable component of the fight against AIDS, because it will bring the subject out of the closet, and we will be able to combat the spread of that disease in an atmosphere where the stigma of criminalisation of homosexual practice exists, sir.
The stakes are even wider, says Wilde, than the reform at hand.
If the Parliament had defeated this, then the moral conservatives knew that they would then be able to try other private members' bills to change the law on other issues as well.
Because I think that homosexuality is a social evil.
And if it had lost, it would have been a huge defeat.
So ridiculous. We are talking about the greatest moral issue that's turned this whole country upside down.
We would have been pushed back a long way.
And we'll have surf, sun and scenery and safe sodomy here, and I've said it before, and it's no laughing matter, because they travel around these people.
Helen Clark.
Speaker, we've been treated again to 15 minutes of the bizarre fantasies of the member for Invercargill.
And it was very clear that they were just waiting for this bill to go down so they could launch an offensive on other things, which included women's rights, race relations, all things like that in New Zealand. They would have targeted all of these issues.
The whole mindset that supported that reactionary set of ideas would have been strengthened.
So it was really important to get this through, to say the New Zealand Parliament will not tolerate these bits of legislation that discriminate against people.
Mr. Chairman, this is a disgraceful bill. It's the thin edge of the wedge. Next we'll probably have from a Labour Party member a bill legalising euthanasia or a bill legalising sexual activity with animals.
It would allow such things to happen as paedophilia.
Night after night, they have raised the issue of incest and paedophilia, and they haven't bothered to look at the truth, to look at what the bill really does. That, I think, is plain disgusting. They're the ones who revel in rolling the word sodomy and anal intercourse off their lips. Night after night, we wallow in the squalid, revolting terminology that these members who are opposing the bill are so fond of saying. And I think, Mr. Chairman, it says a hell of a lot more about their state of mind than it does about what this bill actually will do.
Being treated in this House and in this committee. But it's not going to stop us from speaking at every opportunity against the evil provisions of this bill. And even if we are thrown out of this Parliament, we'll come back fighting, because the majority of New Zealanders don't want it. Don't want it. And no wonder members get frustrated at the chairmanship and this committee with what is happening here.
Order. The member will withdraw and apologise for that reflection on the chair. Mr. Banks. I'll withdraw and apologise.
The campaign against the bill centres around a petition, which organisers claim has been signed by more than 800,000 people. It soon revealed that there are tens of thousands of double-ups, ineligible signatories and fake names, but in any case, it's comfortably the biggest petition the country has ever seen. A few weeks before the bill's second reading, the petition is presented to Parliament with a rally attended by around 700 people. Placards declare New Zealand's largest petition, the people have spoken, and righteousness exalts a nation. They sing the national anthem and a bunch of hymns. A couple of hundred counter-protesters chant, "We're here because we're queer," from behind a row of police. Their signs heckle the rally with the words, "I sign because my pastor told me to," and "I signed 27 times." 91 boxes are stacked at the top of the steps of Parliament. Members of the Boys Brigade stand in rigid lines holding New Zealand flags aloft and wearing sashes emblazoned with the words, "For God, family and country."
It was seriously creepy to see how they had used that model of jingoism, religion, uniforms, all of that brought together to get rid of this bit of legislation. It was very, very scary.
They had advice from American organisations, a slightly different culture in America, more developed fundamentalist church, I suppose. It had the feeling of something at Nuremberg in the 30s, you know. It became called, among us anyway, the Nuremberg Rally.
The rally does have an impact, just not necessarily the impact intended.
It was scary. It really was. You thought, if politics goes this way in New Zealand, we're in for a bad time. But at the same time, if you had a feel for it, you realise that this was out of sync with New Zealand.
And a lot of people just got in touch with us and said, look, that's it for me. If that's what they represent, then I don't support that.
People might not have liked poofters, but they didn't want this sort of stuff. The tide moved against them at that point.
There's a critical moment that comes at the committee stage in Parliament. Opponents of the bill face a choice. If they move an amendment to shift the age of consent to 18, that's sure to win a majority vote, and then if the bill passes, it will mean the age of consent is different for gay men and everyone else.
But they didn't do that because they thought having it go through to the third reading with 16 would ensure that it wasn't passed.
There's another what-if moment. It turns out the Wellington weather is a recurring character in New Zealand politics, and on Wednesday, July 2nd, 1986, it's a dark and stormy night. Thank you very much. With a handful of MPs overseas and others unable to land thanks to the Wellington weather, opponents of the homosexual law reform seize the opportunity, proposing a motion to bin the bill. In the end, it comes down to just one vote. George Gere, Deputy Leader of the National Party, supports decriminalisation, but had wanted the age of consent to be 18. After some soul-searching, he votes with the bill's supporters.
But I'm, sir, prepared to stand up and be counted and say that if the member for North Shore voted with the rest of his colleagues just 1 week ago, we would not be debating this bill tonight.
That's John Banks. He's still stewing over George Gere's decision a week later as a packed Parliament gathers to decide the bill's fate. The backers are confident, and polling shows a clear public majority in its favour. But it's not yet a done deal.
I considered for some time that perhaps the course was to abstain.
This is George Gere.
And I agonised over this point, and I must say that there are some aspects of abstention that are appealing. But in the final analysis, a vote for abstention, I reasoned, was passing the responsibility over to others. And that I'm not prepared to do.
Some shallow humbug and weak rhetoric from the member for North Shore. This day will be remembered as a sad and sickening day for New Zealand. A very black cloud hangs over this Parliament tonight.
At about 10 p.m, the bill goes to the vote.
I was sitting with my partner directly in front of the Speaker in the gallery. It was quite a moment because it was the culmination of this 16 months of fairly intense activity and debate.
The question is that the homosexual law reform bill be now read a third time. The ayes are 49, the noes are 44. It will be read a third time.
I remember going out into the lobby and it was just absolutely full of supporters of, the gay, lesbian community were there in force. It was great and just, we knew we'd made it.
8 years later, the Human Rights Act is updated and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation banned. In a small serendipity, the author of that amendment is National MP Catherine O'Regan. She'd been Marilyn Waring's electorate agent for many years, and at Waring's encouragement, successfully taken over her seat. There's another big wave of transformation rolling through these hectic years: Crown-Māori relations and the place of the Treaty of Waitangi. Hekia Parata won't become a household name until she is made a member of John Key's cabinet, but long before that, she has a ringside seat to New Zealand politics. She's there at Hui Taumata in 1984.
If we were to accept all that we see and hear, we would hardly recognise ourselves as Māori people. The media does its best.
As a young diplomat, she's part of the team running the ANZUS summit in Wellington. She gets posted to Washington, D.C., and spends a lot of time making the case for New Zealand's controversial nuclear policy.
I came home in June 87 because for some months I had been watching what was going on in New Zealand and I was thinking, I'm missing out on this revolution. If you kind of mark it from, that speech in Hui Taumata about what's wrong and what we're told was wrong, and I really felt that I had no right to be in Washington when there was work to be done at home.
Parata returns to lead the Māori Policy Directorate within the newly formed Ministry for the Environment under CEO Roger Blakely.
So I came home to that job, and literally I'd been a week in it, and my chief executive came and he said, "Come on, Hekia, we're going down to 8.4. I didn't know what he was talking about, right? So down we went to the beehive, and I discovered that 8.4 was, you go up into the beehive, and that's where the Cabinet Committee meetings are held. So the door opened, and Roger and I spilled out into this packed central, and it was just grey. A mass of grey men in grey suits. And why that was also very, very obvious to me was, first of all, I couldn't see one brown person there. There might have been, but I couldn't see them instantly in that moment. And secondly, I was in this peacock blue suit, just absolutely stunning contrast to this group. And so I just sat down and I was just drawing breath, and I looked up and I thought, oh my God, there was the real Prime Minister David Lange and the real, Deputy Prime Minister Geoffrey Palmer and Roger Douglas and Richard Prebble. I'd only ever seen them on television, and there they were in this actual room, and I was sitting there thinking, Jesus, okay. Well, it got worse. So then, how are we going to deal with this problem we've got? Because the New Zealand Māori Council has won their case in front of the Court of Appeal, and our state-owned enterprises policy cannot go forward unless we find a resolution to Māori land claims.
Having embarked on a grand program of corporatisation, which saw the creation of a raft of state-owned enterprises, Palmer and his colleagues hit a snag.
Legislation giving more teeth to the Waitangi Tribunal is one of the main areas in the negotiations over the transfer of disputed Crown land to the state-owned enterprises.
The SOE Act transfers a huge amount of land and resource into these new entities. At the same time, there is a growing number of iwi claims on land that had been wrongly taken by the Crown. There are concerns about whether this transfer of land from strict Crown ownership to SOEs would limit Māori claims. And so, Palmer has added to the bill a section requiring that the Crown must not do anything under the Act that is inconsistent with the principles of the treaty.
And Roger said, well, yes, thank you for asking. And as it happens, he said, we've just recently, been fortunate enough to appoint Hekia Parata to be the Director of Māori Policy in the Ministry for the Environment. So I'm just going to let her come forward and speak to, how we might approach this.
After the bill is passed into law, the Māori Council takes the Crown to court. They point to the line that Palmer has added to the bill. That requirement to abide by the treaty, the Council argues, means all transfers must halt until any outstanding Māori claims on those resources are dealt with. The Māori Council wins. It's a big deal. Before anything is transferred to SOEs, the Crown is obliged to set up processes that address whether any of those transfers could breach treaty principles.
So I moved my chair forward and then went into, normal kind of speak, which could have been the answer to anything. I said, clearly, we'll need to get the experts on this problem, and we'll, need to come together and define what the problem is actually, or what the challenge is, and also what the range of solutions that will be acceptable.
The President of the Court of Appeal says, this case is perhaps as important for the future of our country as any that has come before a New Zealand court.
And I must have sounded really confident and on the ball or something, because Geoffrey Palmer said, excellent, that sounds like exactly what we should do. Thank you very much, Ms. Parata. We'll look forward to hearing further from you.
Some Cabinet members urge Palmer simply to legislate over the top of it. Others say appeal to the Privy Council. He says, no, we'll deal with it.
And so our job was to help navigate through that seemingly intractable problem. And the answer that we got to, which was translated into the Treaty of Waitangi State Enterprises Act, was that any Crown land or property that might need to be available for the settlement of a treaty claim needed to be caveated.
That new law basically puts a sticker on the box of all transferred land and resources under the SOE Act, conditional on any claims before the Waitangi Tribunal. And, importantly, the tribunal is given the power in these cases to make binding decisions rather than recommendations. Remember, the tribunal had already had its remit fundamentally extended by the Lange government. In 1975, when the tribunal was created, it was tasked only with considering contemporary claims. But from 1985, it could look at potential breaches dating all the way back to 1840. It is becoming a bigger, more muscular entity.
And that is of particular personal interest because at the time in the Deputy Prime Minister's office, they were looking at, okay, we need to make this a success. We can't have, widen the gate and then not have a really good mechanism for managing it. So what do you think about this Wirra gardener, Hekia? And I said, never heard of him. He said, oh, well, he's apparently a former army officer and, he's been recommended by the tribunal to run it. He'll sort it out. And I said, okay, well, I can make inquiries and I'll let you know, and I mean, I don't know, 6 years later I was married to him.
I think that the fact that Māori people have an avenue, a legal avenue open for them to pursue claims is a good one. Once we educate the public about the roles of the tribunal, the public at large, then we can also point out that Māori people are not using unfair means. They're not using means that are not available to other people to achieve redress for grievances.
Waitangi Tribunal Director, Wirra Gardner.
Having been seconded to work on the SOE issue, Parata is now asked to join the Prime Minister's advisory group.
And in that role, I became the first ever treaty advisor. And that was really interesting to me because I hadn't grown up with the Treaty of Waitangi being a big deal in my life. Once I was in the advisory group, it was my job to get to know, understand and apply it. And so I got very deep into, what it meant, what it could mean, what it was intended to mean and all of those kinds of things.
It's around this time that treaty principles, a concept that attracts considerable debate and controversy in 2024, are becoming a focus.
Literally 5 or 6 of us were sent over to Masterton and we sat in a hotel, meeting room talking about what the principles of the treaty could be.
Geoffrey Palmer has dispatched a group of officials and constitutional lawyer Alex Frame over the hill to rattle something out.
What we needed was a sort of template for the government system. That was what that was designed to do. It wasn't designed to change the law, it was designed to point out what the policy possibilities were. And it's nothing like legislating it in law.
And we came back with I think it was the first 7 principles, and they were understood to be a starter. It was like, how do we translate this idea of the principles into something meaningful and practical that we can then give guidance to government departments about what the government means when they say the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. And the courts and the tribunals have taken that seriously and have gone on to articulate principles because, a preamble with 3 articles, 4 if you're from the north, is an indication of intent. It's not going to prescribe like, other countries that do have written constitutions with amendments and so on and so forth. It's what we mean by it. And the understanding that I developed from working with this government, and I'm not saying it was perfect by any means, but the intent was, how do we have a better New Zealand where there is absolute recognition of and space for the Indigenous iwi of this country to be involved in the development of it, because that's what the treaty intended. And so I have always seen it, therefore, as a relationship management agreement. And it is akin to a marriage in the sense that 2 partners think, well, we can build something new and different together while still retaining who we are. And you don't generally rush into a relationship saying, gee, I hope we lose our land and all our resources. Oh, gosh, it'd be great if our language dies, and we lose our cultural identity. And so how do we translate that founding document into the honourable intent that it had for practical application? And that means that in Article 3, all New Zealand citizens, Māori and non-Māori alike, enjoy the rights and privileges akin to those of the British, caveated by iwi being the authorities in their own regions, caveated by this newfangled thing called a nationwide government. It's really that simple and that fabulous if we just see it for what it is.
There are other major reforms emerging from engagement with Te Ao Māori. A Māori Language Commission is formed. Te Reo Māori becomes an official language.
The important step is to raise the mana of the language. This is what the Māori people are looking for.
Some of the reforms will be short-lived. The Runanga Iwi Bill, designed to devolve government services to iwi, is passed in the twilight of the Labour government.
The Runanga Iwi Act was going to give a legal identity to these iwi, which would allow for public funding, in the taxpayers' purse, to be available for those devolved functions to actually be delivered. When the government came in under Minister Winston Peters, the Runanga Iwi Act was repealed. Iwi weren't seen as being where you could partner to get better outcomes.
But on the whole, Hekia Parata recalls the time like this.
Honestly, for me anyway, it was a halcyon period to be a public servant because it was so focused on serving the public. Yes, with a specific, very clear agenda, which I drank the Kool-Aid, like how do we separate policy from delivery? How do we make that delivery far more relevant for the people who are receiving it? How is there, much better devolution to the communities of New Zealand, not just to Māori communities, but in particular, how do we honour the Treaty of Waitangi? What will that look like? How do we make that possible? Back in that period, Sir Hepi Te Hiuhiu was hosting nationwide hui called the Hirangi Hui, and, people were flocking there for discussions about what constitutional change should be. And I remember writing a speech for Prime Minister Lange, and he gave it at the Chateau at Tongariro, in which I had put a sentence, and I pointed it out to him. We need to honour the Treaty of Waitangi as the founding document of our country, of our nation. And I said to him, so I'm using the definitive the. And he said, I see and understand that, and I will deliver that speech. And so from that time, I then had the responsibility and the great pleasure of telling government departments that is what the government sees as the status of this document.
On Waitangi Day in 1990, Queen Elizabeth II speaks at the treaty grounds, 150 years after the treaty signing.
Today, we are strong enough and honest enough to learn the lessons of the last 150 years and to admit that the treaty has been imperfectly observed.
That day in Waitangi sees widespread protest and heckling. One speaker does win the crowd over, the Bishop of Aotearoa, Whakahuihui Verco.
We have not honoured each other in the promises that we made on the sacred ground. I don't want to debate the treaty. I don't want to renegotiate the treaty. I want the treaty to stand firmly as the unity, the means by which we are made one nation.
Over the course of the Fourth Labour government, there are a host of other reforms we haven't mentioned. A list as long as a long white cloud. There's the creation of a Department of Conservation, the introduction of the Resource Management Bill, which would go on to become the RMA, the Tomorrow's School project led by Education Minister David Lange, an overhaul of the local government structure, the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, and the independence of the Reserve Bank, with Governor Don Brash tasked with keeping inflation within a target range.
We want to make it certain that no future politician can interfere with the bank's primary objective.
Roger Douglas's opposite number, National Finance spokesperson Ruth Richardson, she likes it.
The decision to put the Reserve Bank on a more autonomous footing is the only measure in the budget that I can applaud.
Rob Muldoon, still hanging in Parliament, not so much.
Ruth Richardson is still in the economic kindergarten, unfortunately.
At a time that inflation target seems like a strange, revolutionary thing to do, but it catches on. Today, it is the orthodoxy for central banks across the Western world. But who picked the target?
I did that.
It was kind of plucked out of the air.
I floated the idea of 0 to 2 somewhere, and it got picked up. and ran.
Funny old world, isn't it?
It is bullshit, isn't it?
And another reform, a really big one, electoral reform. This whole story we've been telling takes place in a pre-MMP era. Without first past the post, there's a whole lot of it that you just couldn't imagine happening. In 1978 and 1981, the Labour Party had received more overall votes than National, but won fewer seats, and so Muldoon's National Party enjoyed, as Geoffrey Palmer put it, unbridled power. All of that, and the fact that under first past the post, small parties were essentially shut out of meaningful representation, prompt Palmer to order up a Royal Commission on Electoral Reform in 1985. He makes sure that constitutional experts and statisticians are appointed to the task rather than just ex-politicians, and it comes back recommending a change from first past the post to a proportional system.
Both the National Party and the Labour Party didn't like the report.
Unsurprisingly, all existing politicians said, not on my watch, thank you very much.
That's Margaret Wilson.
Lange misread his briefing notes and somehow thought we'd agreed to it.
David misspoke on a television program and said we would have a referendum.
There were only about 10 or 11 people, including me in the Labour Party caucus, who supported it. But I thought, oh, well, that's good.
I can't believe I thought all my happy days had come.
It was clearly a mistake at the time. I was doing a debate and I had little key cards, and they were perfectly written key cards, and they had been furnished to me by my staff, and I read them wrongly. Then
National had to counter. So Bolger agreed to have a referendum as well. And so that's how New Zealand got MMP. Trying to explain this to people overseas was interesting.
And I made a pledge which I deeply regret, and I am responsible for introducing the concept of MMP by accident, which it undoubtedly is.
There are contrapuntal harmonies in New Zealand politics, and that's a good example of one.
Just quickly, back on the homosexual law reform.
There were a lot of MP seniors who did not want this introduced because they said it'll just be a distraction from all the other things we have to do.
We skidded past this point earlier. Here's Labour leader Chris Hipkins in a speech in March 2024.
Later this year, we will mark a significant and a challenging milestone in the Labour Party's history. It will be the 40th anniversary of the election of the fourth Labour government. We'll remember with pride the early steps that government took to stamp our proudly nuclear-free mark on our foreign policy. The work that government took to advance human rights, particularly in areas like homosexual law reform.
OK, stop there for a second. Can the Labour government really claim this one? After all, it wasn't a government bill, and it's barely mentioned in the memoirs and biographies of the big figures of the time.
They didn't own it then, and they made life difficult for me. Really difficult, actually, because I had pushed them into the position of having to vote on this issue. So the Labour caucus didn't want that issue there. Absolutely no doubt about that. They did not want this issue on the agenda. But it had to be on the agenda.
There were a number of people in the party who regarded Fran Wilde's bill as a distraction.
Even after it happened, they didn't want to admit that how big a kind of a seismic shift it was in New Zealand society, which is interesting. And I certainly, in later years, realised that it did me no good whatsoever in terms of a parliamentary career, but it had to be done.
The reason Hipkins amplifies and exaggerates these parts of the fourth Labour government record is clear enough. It's because its overarching legacy is to this day so deeply vexed. This is a chapter in Labour's history quite unlike any other. And it's a battle of ideas personified in a dramatic, harrowing, dumbfounding breakdown in the political relationship of a Prime Minister and a Finance Minister.
It was an absolute breach, total defiance.
I wanted to make some big changes.
18 months of vicious internecine warfare.
It's poisoned the Labour Party for some people.
They're privatising sanity itself.
I can't remember which of us called it the campaign to drive Douglas mad.
In the end, he lied to me.
That's next on Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government, is written and presented by me, Toby Manhire, for the Spin-Off Podcast Network, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. The producer is Sophie Dowson, the audio editor and sound designer is Tiahe Butler, the researchers are Hannah Lou and Rachel Judkins, the graphic designer is Archie Banal, and the executive producers are Duncan Grieve and Jane Yee. Archival audio in this episode is from the RNZ collection at Ngā Taonga Sound and Vision and Kawe Mahara Queer Archives Aotearoa. Go and check them out, there's lots to read there. You can read a full list of sources and a bunch of other written material that digs deeper into the story by clicking the link in the show notes. Thanks to Linda Evans, Steve Russell, Finlay McDonald, Amber Reesby, Mad Chapman, Anna Rafferty Connell, Jen Follett, Isaiah Tour, Ben Fagan, Bernard Hickey, Box Cutter, and everyone who made the time to speak with us. Kia ora, this is Toby Manhire. Thank you for listening to Juggernaut. I hope you're enjoying this series. A lot of work from a small but talented group of people went into making this podcast, and we're extremely grateful to New Zealand On Air for supporting the project. It also couldn't have happened without the support of our members. If you like what we do here at the Spin-Off and would like to see more projects like Juggernaut out in the world, then please consider becoming a Spin-Off member. Visit thespinoff.co.nz/members to help us do more of the work you value.
This is Climate Adaptation.
We are the pōtiki of the taiao.
And the words of those keeping the home fires burning.
It's more than just going along and planting some trees. You got to be able to defend that place to the end of your life.
We have the solutions. We just need to come back to the belief in ourselves as rangatira.
Join me, Nadine Hura, and Ruia Āpirahama, the Kōpapa Korangi Series 2, Hekia. Brought to you by Te Komatu o Te Tonga, the Deep South Challenge, out now on the Spin-Off Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.